This presentation goes along with the reading that was linked to the on Blackboard to a journal article that was published a number of years ago by Gabriel and Baker. Uh, it's a very good publication and reading that relates back to how the interrelationship and how business and financial risk are interrelated. It's more of a theoretical paper, more of a theoretical concept. Uh, so you may ask, well, why? How do you apply it? Well, the real value of understanding this interrelationship between business and financial risk is to really understand how certain risk management tools are going to affect your overall risk profile. And so that's where we are with this. And I'm going to go through this, and then I certainly encourage you to read that paper. As we've defined business risk before, it's the risk that's inherent in the firm, independent of the way the firm is financed. It's generally reflecting the variability of net returns, operating returns to that business. In other words, it has to do with the variability relative to production, the variability with regard to cost of production, the variability with regard to market prices, so that uh, the way the firm is financed really has no direct bearing upon business risk. Whether there's no debt or whether there's some debt, it shouldn't affect. That financing should not have an effect upon the variability of net operating cash flows. The sources of business risk, which we have identified before, is market prices for the product, input prices for the cost of production, and yields. And so we can define business risk here. We're going to label it BR is sigma 1 divided by CX. Okay, now where sigma 1 here is the standard deviation of net cash flows without debt financing. And CX is the expected net cash flows without debt financing. So in other words, what this is that we take the variability of cash flows expressed as a standard deviation of those net cash flows over time, and we divide by the expected value or the average cash flows. This gives us a measure of the variability. We just might recognize this formula as the coefficient of variation, where you're taking the standard deviation and dividing it by the expected value. That's how we can define business risk. Now, when we look at financial risk, it's the added variability of net cash flows whenever you have fixed financial obligations that are associated with debt financing. In other words, I've got the variability of cash flows in my operating incomes, but then I've got these fixed financial obligations over here that I've got to meet, meaning term debt that has to be met on a regular basis. In other words, for maybe equipment payments, land payments, other types of term debt that I have to meet. Whenever I add that into this, then I have increased the variability of those cash flows because I have to meet those financial obligations. Now, defining financial risk is a little more complex than business risk. We really can't define financial risk without just saying, okay, it's total risk minus business risk. That's one way of looking at it. Another way that it can be expressed is that if we look at that top equation there, financial risk is sigma 2, which is the standard deviation of cash flows after we take into account financing. Divide that by the average expected cash flows minus the financing, the obligation, the fixed financial obligation, which is I. So that one term there really is defining total risk. And total risk is the variability of cash flows divided by the average expected cash flows minus the financial obligation. So that can be defined as total risk. The other term is business risk, and we've defined that. And so we can look at this and say, well, it's total risk minus business risk. Now, for simplicity, we can make the assumption that the variability of cash flows without financing is equal to the variability of cash flows with financing. In other words, the amount of, or the presence of fixed financial obligations doesn't impact the variability of those cash flows. So if we make the assumption that sigma 1 and sigma 2 are equal, we can then take that equation that we defined earlier with regard to financial risk, and we can break it down into two components. One is business risk, sigma 1 over Cx, and then we can multiply that times this term that is the financial obligation for fixed debt divided by the amount of cash flow that would be available after you make those fixed debt payments. Now, the point here is when we look at that second term, as you increase term debt, in other words, I is going up. When I goes up, it increases the numerator of that fraction, and it decreases the denominator because you're increasing the amount of I that's coming out of your cash flows. So what happens is as you increase debt financing, in other words, you have more term debt, that term gets larger. In other words, it goes up as you increase financing. And so that can be looked at as a multiplier. In other words, the financial risk is really the business risk times the amount of leverage that you have within the business. And so as you increase your leverage, you magnify the business risk, which increases your financial risk. So this statement for financial risk indicates that financial risk is determined by the degree of business risk that you have inherent in the firm and that relationship between the term debt divided by the residual cash flows after you have satisfied that term debt. And so this is the multiplier as we indicated earlier. Now, if we go back and look at what total risk looks like, and we define that as sigma over Cx minus I, we can restate that as business risk, in other words, sigma 1 over Cx times the term Cx over Cx minus I. So again, if you look at the relationship there on total risk, it's a business risk, but it's also then magnified as you look at, as you take on more debt, the value of I increases. And so as you look at that term, Cx would be constant, in other words, based on whatever the variability or the expected value is. But as you take on more debt, again, the denominator is going down. And so that term is increasing as you increase I. And so that starts magnifying the business risk. So total risk is business risk times a term that is tied to the financing and the obligations that you've taken on. So we can look at total risk constraint, and what we're looking at here is we're taking that term for total risk, and we're saying that there is some level of total risk that really we don't want to get past. In other words, there is a certain level of risk that we feel like that if we go beyond that, then we have an increased chance of business failure, an increased chance of not being able to satisfy our fixed financial obligation. And so this comes back to a concept we discussed a little bit earlier of risk balancing. is that as you see a change in business risk, whether that business risk goes up or whether that business risk goes down, there needs to be potentially a change in your financial risk. And so if you increase the business risk within the operation, then you need to balance it back with a reduction in financial risk. Same token, if you decrease business risk, then you may have an opportunity there to take on more financial risk. For instance, if you see if price support programs were to change where the level of business risk was to increase, then the level of total risk would increase, and the business would really need to start looking at whether or not that increase in total risk was sufficient to warrant a decrease in the financial risk. So if the level of total risk exceeded the constrained level, there may need to be an adjustment in financial risk to maintain a total risk below the constrained level. So what we're seeing here is that how do we, as we look at this in a theoretical standpoint, how do we look at the risk management in conjunction with business risk and financial risk? We can go back and look at those things that affect the variability or that standard deviation of cash flows and the level of cash flows. Things that can mitigate the variation of those cash flows can be crop insurance, they can be better marketing, it can be diversification, as we've talked about. Those risk management practices that reduce that level of variability that we have in cash flows. And when we reduce that level of variability, then that reduces our business risk. That reduces our financial risk. And so the real key here is, first of all, to look at those things that we can do within our management system to control the variability of those cash flows. And secondly, to make sure that we're not overloading the business with debt and taking on too much risk. So again, as I say, this is from a theoretical standpoint, but it does point out to us where we can impact our total risk by looking at risk management practices.